Across the globe, young people are taking action to bring about the changes they want to see.
Young activists are calling for climate action and gender equality, standing together against discrimination and to end police brutality. They work together across borders to raise awareness for problems that need to be addressed and call for radical transformation.
Despite young people consistently standing up and calling for meaningful change, we're still seeing increasing barriers at play for participation. In the G20, only 2 leaders are under the age of 50.
And a good example of underrepresentation can be seen in Africa, where there is a 45-year age gap between the median age of the population and that of its presidents. And in many cultures, young people are expected to not challenge their elders.
2 out of 3 countries do not consult young people in the creation and process of poverty reduction strategies and national development plans. A world with real youth inclusion would be a world where young people are recognized as leaders, where young people are not only heard, but where the things that they care about are reflected in politics and in practice. It would be a world where young people and what they care for and what they stand for is taken seriously.
Firstly, we need to start questioning real inclusion in decision-making. True youth representation in decision-making must include those most affected to reflect young people's diverse lived experiences.
Second of all, we must recognize the impact and the work that young people are already doing and the change they have already created.
Lastly, all policies need to reflect young people's concerns and, more importantly, their leadership. As Amanda Gorman, the youngest poet laureate to speak at the US presidential inauguration, reminded us,
youth are transforming our future as we speak. So pass the mic. Let us together imagine and co-create a world where young people make the big decisions.
Hello and welcome everybody to Cheltenham's fantastic new venue, VoiceBox. And this is a space for young people to have their voices heard. So in light of this, we're going to discuss 2 powerful and, more importantly, exciting questions today. How can we imagine a better world, and how are young people at the forefront of shaping this future? So from the climate crisis to peacekeeping, from the future of multilateralism to rapidly shifting geopolitical dynamics, the world our generation will inherit is increasingly uncertain. So we're left with the question, how do we approach these huge challenges? And how do we ensure that young people get a seat at the table when it comes to decision-making that affects our future? My name is Emily, and I'm a student at Cambridge University. I'm a climate activist, and I'm a young advisor at the Global Centre of Adaptation, and I'll be moderating today's session. And today we have the fantastic opportunity to hear from 2 young advisors from international affairs think tank Chatham House. We are here to celebrate young people's voices, and the Young Advisors panel is a key example of how the next generation can be central to decision-making and change. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to Carm Paul Christian and to Samuel Ajake. So would you like to tell me a little bit more about yourselves and how you got into international affairs?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So hello, everybody. My name's Sam, or Samuel. You guys can choose. I'm currently a student at the University of Oxford in my 2nd year, studying history and French. And as well as being a young advisor, I've worked with a few kind of organizations, such as the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, and also a kind of media organization I worked with over the past year called the Common Sense Network. And essentially, what my kind of passion is hopefully involving young people within this decision-making process, because I'm really passionate about this idea of international development requires creative problem solving, and I think creativity and that innovation is really rooted in having young people involved just in that whole process. So that's really my whole interest, and hopefully this will be a great event discussing really some more of the specifics of that. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Carm. I'm also an advisor at Chatham House. I try not to say the young part because I feel like sometimes when we start putting those prefixes in front of things, we already start to get down the conversation where is the value, are you pigeonholed and all that sort of stuff. But I've been supporting Chatham House for the last year now, and I also read history at Oxford, as Samuel did. I didn't do the French part, I'm not bilingual in any form, but I've been involved in international relations for about 8 years now, I would say. Before I went to university, I did a lot of international development work, volunteering in developing parts of rural Africa, particularly focusing around persons with disabilities and disabled rights activity. Then when I went through university, I graduated, I went into investment banking. I worked for the Rothschild Family Investment Bank. and I did a lot of work with corporates around access to global markets and how can you encourage a lot of the work that I did that I didn't want to do, was just standard vanilla private financing. But the work I tried to get into was actually how do you mobilize capital markets for development and change. I then left the banking industry and went into social and impact investing and direct investment into international development. And I enjoyed that. I worked in loads of places around the world on behalf of DFID, Commonwealth Youth Council, and other areas like that. I then became quite tired and frustrated at where the funding gaps were in a lot of situations, and I returned to investment banking 3 years ago now, and I now work for the Royal Bank of Scotland, or NatWest Group as we're now called, and I have a large input into the Sustainable Finance Initiative that we're working on. So yeah, I'm very keen on getting young people more involved in international development, but I'm also more keen on involving larger corporates and other institutions and mobilizing capital towards ends that we all need it to go towards. Thank you.
And I think we've kind of touched exactly on what we want to talk about today. It's young people's innovation and how we can't change the problems with the same thinking that's caused the problems. So I think, yeah, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So I think going straight into the quote-unquote young advisor role, we're going to call it that, at Chatham House. Maybe you could explain what this role is, how you got into this role, and maybe what you do in this role and what sort of things you're working on, and why it's important to have a quote-unquote young voice within institutions that are working on the forefront of global problems.
Yeah, sure. So about what we are, essentially we're a panel of about 20, let's say 20, 21 young people that have had some form of engagement with international affairs, whether that be, 17, there's even a 17-year-old, I think, on the panel, ranging to people in their kind of late 20s. And the whole point is that they kind of present us with different issues, their problems with engaging with young people. Chatham House is an incredibly old organization, but the problem is also that they tend to have a specific audience. That audience tends to be people that are old, people that have experience with international affairs, and not, the 17-year-old or the 16-year-old that maybe has not even gone abroad. How do they get these type of people engaged? How do they get younger people engaged? How I got into this role, quite roundabout. I didn't expect to really be in the role. It was really just, I'd been working for that organization that I spoke about, the Common Sense Network, and one of the leader of the organization kind of reached out to me, saw the opportunity, thought it might work for me, did the interview, and thankfully I'm there now. But I would really say that, and I think it's probably one of the problems that we can talk about later today, is that I would have seen Chatham House and been like, what, me involved? Nah, that's not possible. I would have seen the name, I would have seen the fact that they produce articles and things like that, and I would have been like, no, they're not looking for someone like me, they're looking for someone who's more accomplished or something like that. But really, it was just, that didn't really stop me from making a contribution, which is one of the things that makes me so passionate now about getting other young people involved in spaces like these, and even bigger, better spaces in the future. But you can...
Yeah, no, I think you captured it very well. I think one of the interesting things about the board for me is it's quite timely. We came together around the centenary. It's been 100 years since Chatham House has been around, and it's like, how do you not reinvent it, but how do you keep it alive in the consciousness and the minds of young people as we go forward and encourage more people to come through? And I think another thing that was really important, why I wanted to be a part of it, is that typically a lot of people who have academic backgrounds, quote unquote, whatever that means, tend to oscillate around Chatham House, and someone like me who's more day-to-day in corporate, but actually still tries to be involved in social, community, and ideological things, it's a chance for me to help, I guess, broaden the perspective and see how do we bridge that gap between what can sometimes feel like siloed ivory tower thinking and actually what's happening in different areas of community, society, and even corporate, where I think we need to see a lot of change. So yeah, I became a part of the board in a roundabout way. I've been engaging with Chatham House for, I'd say, about 5 years or so now. I actually met Robin, the CEO, at another event. It was the Ditchley Foundation. It was a roundtable discussion around social impact and how do we, again, mobilize capital towards development. And there was a strong part of the topic in the room. There was about 30 of us, I would say, and I was one of 2 people under 30. And it became a core part of the discussion like we're having now, how do you get more young people involved? And we put a challenge to the people in the room to say, you're all leaders in some sort of space, why are we not doing it? Why are we asking the questions? And Robin was the first person to just stand up and say, we should get you involved. And 5 days later, he invited us to the Chatham House annual conference, and we went there, and I continued to be engaged since then. And I think that was a real turning point for me, to see someone who was in a position to actually make the change just say, yes, I'm going to do something about it, and I came along. So yeah, I've been really engaged with the institution since then, and I went through the interview process last year, similar to Samuel, and joined the board.
I think that is such an important point what you just made there about what is leadership, and I think that's something we'll come on to later. Leadership doesn't have to equate with age or experience. It can be about passion, it can be about your drive and your willingness to make change, and I think that's something that young people can bring to the table in their innovation and their transformation. But back to what you're doing more on a day-to-day, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the projects that the young advisors have worked on so far. Perhaps what do you think are the biggest challenges facing young people as they inherit this increasingly complex, changing world in the light of climate change, COVID, and how has that fed into what you're doing as young advisors?
Yeah, big question.
Big question. Big questions today.
I'll start on this one. I was involved in an interesting project around engagement and how do we use social media to engage more people, not just young people, but a big focus on young people as well. I think that was quite interesting because we did a lot of analytics around the current social media channels you have. Are they fit for purpose? Is there a reason you're on Twitter versus Instagram, or what other platforms can allow you to go directly to the communities you're supposed to reach? We had a lot of questions around actually linguistic barriers. We're an international organization. One thing we didn't mention is that people on the board are not just in the UK, they're from all around the world. And if you're constantly tweeting in a specific language, or you're constantly tweeting around issues that seem to be more focused around a particular demographic or particular political sphere, how do you really ensure you have that engagement? So yeah, we did a bit of a project on what social media channels we're using, how do we do it, what is the language we speak, what's the narrative that comes through. We had some ideas about maybe we should have a youth-specific Twitter handle, because we have, Chatham House Africa or Chatham House this and that, but actually should we have a youth one? And then we kind of decide on the idea, we shouldn't specifically have a youth one, because then are we delineating again where to say, we don't have an elderly one and a middle-aged and a youth one, why would we do this? It's actually, how do you make sure the conversations are all-encompassing and accessible to all? So yeah, that was a really interesting project that I worked on recently as well.
Yeah, and I guess following up from that, but taking on a different approach, my kind of stream that I was working on with my other advisors was really focusing on how we can bridge the kind of generational gap between young people who may have an interest in international affairs and then the experts who might have spent 20 years working in the country, spoken to presidents, prime ministers and all of that, and how do you bring them together in the same room without the experts feeling like these people aren't worth my time, and the young people feeling like, why am I even in the room with this person? There's too much of a gap between us. I've spoken to Robin, who is actually more towards the expert side, and I'm probably a lot more towards the other side, and I think we've been able to have some decent conversations. Ask him if you want to see if that's really true. And we were really thinking about how do we really break this fear on one side and this potential kind of judgment on the other side. And we really discovered that it's about, one, how do we actually change the way that certain conversations are framed? So Chatham House has so many different discussions, but the questions, the question format, and the way that everything will be approached is almost like you have to come into the space with a certain level of information, and your questions and everything you have to say has to reflect that. Whereas a lot of young people will have a passion, but they may not have the information. They have my passion, but not the experience. And we were really just trying to kind of mull through that. We saw different ways that we need to create a tradition of having young people in a room. So we made suggestions such as, when you're making decisions on what new policy to make, always have a young person in the room. And it's like we're mirroring kind of previous policies that have been taken to ensure that there's always a woman in the room when a certain policy decision has been taken. Why not also do that with young people? Why not always make sure that that's something that's part of the decision-making process? And I think tackling this is hard. I think it's not something that we fix within two policy suggestions and we're like, yeah, Chatham House is doing it perfectly. But I think this is something that I'm really passionate about, because it's affected me even within Chatham House and also at the start of my kind of academic journey and professional journey as well.
I think that's a question that's coming up a lot, is how can we make sure that if youth are having a seat at the table, how is it meaningful? There's one thing putting the youth in the room, but how do we ensure that that seat isn't tokenistic, or it's not just, we're creating a youth board or this, so that we're ticking the checkbox that youth have their voices heard. Do you think we're seeing a change towards more meaningful youth engagement? Do you feel like in situations within the board or in more generally in life that young people's voices are being heard and it's being taken on board, or do you still feel like there's a long way to go in that?
I'm happy to start with this. To put it simply, I think there's a long way to go. I think if you ask a lot of people in positions of power what they think of young people and their involvement, I think there will always there's this narrative of kind of young people are like, oh, young people are always like this. Like young people's always passionate when they're young, and then as they grow up, they start to focus on what's actually important, you know. And this is the kind of narrative that surrounds, you know, getting young people involved. And though we do have this kind of companies are trying to making an effort to build a narrative of we're involving young people. It can really be tokenistic. It can really be surface level. And I think that's one of the big changes, and there's real change that's needed to that. How that takes place is a much harder question. And I think it starts with having, I think advisory positions can be very, very useful, but advisory, if you're just making suggestions and they're never taken on, then that makes zero difference. You actually need to, when we say decision making, we mean like actually shaping policies that are going to be implemented, not just making a suggestion which can be pushed to the back burner. And I think that's what's really needed. When you're creating an advisory panel, for example, you have to make a commitment to really implement policies. If you're going to make an initiative that targets young people, you need to make an effort to bring them in there and then hopefully do some form of follow-up, not just say, we did this. Follow-up, you know, try and get their opinions after an event you've done. Try and see how you can support them in their journeys, see how you can connect them with these experts that your organization has. And these are just the small ways that you can actually push young people so that, one, they have that information that you're saying, young people don't have any of it. And two, so that you actually get exposure to their voices and their opinions, and hopefully these people within positions of power will see, that person actually has something of merit which could actually benefit what I'm doing and what I hope to see.
No, I think there's a mixture, and it depends what sphere you're in and who you're speaking to. In terms of youth involvement, like I'll take it outside of politics specifically. Like I sit on the board of a number of charities in the UK. And the concept of lived experience is being spoken about a lot more, not just in terms of young people, but different underrepresented demographics or characteristics, and people are being brought in to be the voice of that population sometimes, when they should be potentially being brought in to be representative of a voice that exists within the population, but not but you can't bring someone into as if they speak for the whole population. I think that's a difficulty. Another area I see a lot of young people being brought in is around like technology. If it's social media or technology, bring a young person in because they know all about this stuff and they can do that. I mean, I know some young people, loads of young people that are great on Twitter when they're personally tweeting, but they can't do your marketing campaign for Chatham House, and it doesn't translate in that way. And I think we have to be very, very careful that as we try to quotify or whatever that kind of representation, that we don't do it in a pigeonholing way. On the other side, I have seen some meaningful steps. I remember when I first started out trying to get involved in kind of charity boards and things. I started off as a school governor, and a number of kind of youth trustee roles. They were specifically called young trustee roles are being brought out, and people were being brought in, as I say, and they weren't being capacity built. They weren't being supported, and they weren't being exposed to all the levels of discussion that are happening at the board. They were being tokenly brought in and specifically brought in for certain things. I think where I'm seeing now, I'm seeing a lot of younger people being brought onto trustee boards and small organizations. I say young, but the average age of a trustee is 40 plus. So young people now are still like, a lot of the young people that are on boards now are older than me still, but I'm definitely seeing that voice being brought more into conversations, and I think it is very important. But for me, the big tension I find is that not just with young people, when it comes to any groups, when we talk about the gender conversation or whatever, a lot of the time excuses are given to say the person hasn't got this skill set or they haven't learned this, without recognizing the kind of systemic barriers that haven't allowed people to develop into those things. So yes, we should bring more young people on, but we should definitely be doing it in a way where capacity building them, not giving them too much, not like making them bite off more than they can chew, such you can say, we never should have had young people on this board because they couldn't make the right decision. We should actually be incrementally introducing that in a way where you're focused on the needs and engaging. But I think the ultimate point I would make on that is we need to really move away from equating age with experience or knowledge. because so many criteria de facto rule people out based on the assumption that if you haven't been doing this for 20, 30 years, you don't have as much to add. And I think there's definitely, there's clearly value in years of experience and learning nuance and understanding, but there's also value in fresh perspectives, there's also value in just, as we talked about, lived experience. So I think it's coming, and in some areas it's different compared to others, but there definitely more needs to be done, I agree with Samuel.
So I think it's clear that there are still a lot of barriers that young people have to overcome, whether that's perception, whether that is capacity building or quote-unquote experience and getting that experience. So have you found that you've had to face some of these barriers yourself? Like, what would you say are the key barriers young people today are having to overcome? And perhaps if we're being more solution-focused, like how do you think we can overcome these barriers that we've mentioned that are still currently in place?
Need some time to more that one.
Because I think we've talked about we're like overcoming perceptions here. So we've spoken about how Chatham House is an older institution. Same with Cheltenham Literature Festivals. They've introduced these new venues. We've got Voicebox for the first time, which is introducing a new demographics, and it's a new type of space for young people to engage. I think that's one key way is we can introduce new ways of engaging with younger people where we don't necessarily have to bring them into existing ways. We can transform the way we think about young people engaging. But I definitely think there are barriers we can overcome there.
I think, especially speaking from the perspective of what like young people like me can also do to overcome those barriers, I think there are some steps that we can definitely take. Because one thing that I've mentioned is, of course, some experts may have a certain view of young people, but then many young people like me will also have internalized that view. So we'll also think, I can't contribute to this discussion because of experience. So such a big thing is young people being willing to put themselves forward for situations. Like even this event right here, like I still have to send an email and be like, I want to take part. Like small things like that. Like you have to be willing to put yourself forward, even if it's like, I may not have as much experience in terms of years. Young people really need to be willing to do that. And then the second is, there is real value. Like one thing I will emphasize, there's real value to having information. Information is important. And so one thing that we also need to do is make an effort to learn, make an effort to just, I guess, seek to be knowledgeable about a situation. And that's seeking to be knowledgeable and speaking to people, trying to learn from other people's experience is such a big step. Because that seeking to learn from other people's experience, just by the questions that you ask, can allow some of those people, some of those experts, some of those leaders, some of those business leaders to actually see, this person has such a passion, has such a desire to learn, that they can definitely feed into this process without even knowing as much as I may. So I think there are some steps that young people can also make to break those barriers, because once again, I think if we as young people are just waiting for everybody else to break these barriers, it's going to take a long time. If we try and push past them, then I think there'll be a lot more progress made a lot quicker, which is, I think, when we see the current state of the world, I think it's kind of what we need.
Wow. I completely agree with everything you said. I'm trying to think systemically as well as, I guess, for me, a lot of it is psychologically, because I touched on it at the beginning, but it might sound small, but to me, the nomenclature is everything. Like, when you say, this is my young advisory board, this is my young advisor, this is my young trustee, I find it quite infantilizing, or I struggle to understand what you're trying to communicate by saying that. Because for me, it moves it away from a competency-based viewpoint, from a representative-based viewpoint. And I can tell you, the Chatham House process to apply to be a young advisor was rigorous. And you think they just went to a school and picked 10 young people and said, come and speak to us. And I feel like I remember when I was about 19, I have a younger brother who's like 3 years younger than me. I started bringing him to a few parties with me and my friends. And I would just say, this is my younger brother. And people would be like, oh, hey, and just sit him in the corner or like give him not one out. I remember one day he pulled me aside and said, can you stop doing that? Can you just say, this is my brother? And I started doing that, and people started talking to him because he was his own person. and this is obviously not exactly the same, but I feel like we need to, as a society, think about what projections are we accidentally, inadvertently, sometimes necessarily putting on, because I don't want to put you in front as a young advisor. I want you to put in front of this board and have expectations of you to be able to speak to that level or that standard or whatever. But I think there's a balancing act to do. Beyond that, in terms of literal actions, I feel like, as Sam alluded to, there's things young people themselves can be doing. Like myself now, I always try to be vocal and spread the word to other young people about opportunities that I've been able to get into. Here's an institution that I know values young people's perspectives, or here's an institution that I know isn't going to assess you or put you in this box or whatever. Like, maybe you should apply here or speak to this person. And I think that kind of knowledge sharing is definitely part of the role that we ourselves as young people can do. Yeah. I think there's more to do for young people to galvanize as they're a movement. There is some personal responsibility about having the weight of a political force and being able to vocalize things and come as a pack rather than individual voices. Or, I think on social media, we have done a lot, and it's been a great equalizer and democratized access to being able to platform voices. But when it translates sometimes into institutional engagement, whether it's local politics or whether it's national politics, there is more to be done in that infrastructure. In terms of, on the flip side, what actual other institutions can be doing, I think things like the Panel of Young Advisors is a start. I think things like VoiceBox here is a start. Even the space of Cheltenham Literature Festival wasn't always accessible to young people in the way it was now. So actually putting out symbols that let people know this place is for you, or we're at least trying to make those changes. We start making those inroads, and it leaves space for young people to come in and build on those inroads, and actually it becomes a pathway, and then it becomes a ladder, and I think that is kind of the direction that we need to be going more into.
And I guess something you touched on there is like how social media can kind of help young people engage in international affairs, sometimes it can be negatively, but also there are lots of positive opportunities. It's opened young people's minds up to maybe some issues and topics they wouldn't have otherwise been able to engage with. We've seen the rise of online activism with the Digital Fridays for Futures. I think perhaps when we're talking about young people and their added value to these discussions, maybe we could talk a bit about innovation, how young people are perhaps using different modes to kind of engage in international affairs, and how that can help maybe transform some of the questions that we're at a bit of a stalemate with. I know in your introduction, Samuel, you spoke a lot about like young people and the innovation that they inherently have. So perhaps we could talk a bit about young people and how innovation can help shape the future.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've mentioned, I guess I've spoken about knowledge. I think young people today are more keyed in to what's going on in the world than they've ever been.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, it's sometimes within the filter through of social media, which means that there's a lot of problems with that, with social media. We could go through that. I think that's a whole other event that we could go into. But that doesn't negate the fact that young people are interested in what's going on in the world, and they see that there's a genuine. They genuinely want to be connected with what's going on in the world. And I think that's such an important thing, because that means people are willing to use social media to learn. Now, we can start thinking about how we can change social media so that it's more beneficial, I think, for people to not just receive biased opinions and be surrounded by their own biased opinions. But if we're thinking about innovation within international affairs, social media will be such a big way for people across the world to share their stories. And I think we've already seen that. We've seen that in various situations over the past year. Like, even when we think about End SARS in Nigeria specifically, like specific stories got spread so far over the world. And I think there was a sequence of months where I remember I would see each month there would be a new African country, and there'd be emphasis on a specific aspect of corruption or a problem within that country. And these are stories that you'd never get access to in another situation. Yeah. Yet through social media, through the use of things like hashtags and things like that, people were gaining access to understanding aspects of injustice that people just wouldn't know about. And in that sense, young people have a real, just knack, I think, for spreading the word of things and making it genuinely a beneficial thing to learn about what's going on in the world. And that's something that organizations, when they see that, they shouldn't just be like, oh, it's young people just, I don't know, like doing their little thing. This is their I don't know how people see it other than like this is something that is quite a phenomenon that people should hopefully be looking at. Like if Chatham House, or like we keep on using Chatham House as an example, it's because we're involved with this. But if Chatham House see that this is how certain people are engaging with the world, and Chatham House want to, get people engaged with a certain understanding of a certain, maybe critical view of a certain topic. Like feeding into what young people are doing on social media is such a key way of doing that. But you can't do that effectively unless you have young people feeding into your process. And it's a simple thing. And then if you want to really figure out, okay, we're talking about the future and you might be doing a paper on the future, cool. Don't just do a survey. Get young people involved in, maybe get young people to write comments on how they see the future, because you might be writing, you might be the one with the experience, but who's going to be living in that future? So, and young people will find ways to present that information and their opinion in a more innovative way than you could ever think. So generally there's so much to learn from young people in that sense, and through social media, the innovation is unlimited, really. So, okay.
I think for me, the great thing about social media and international relations is kind of, it's broken down barriers a lot more, especially on Twitter. Like, I can find out live news faster than on Twitter from people tweeting than I can actually have it reported. And I think it's completely removed the barrier to entry and kind of removed the monopoly on reporting from mainstream news organizations and even alternative news organizations that are more well funded than your everyday Joe that can actually say, I was here, I saw this is what happened. You can get live witness accounts. We see the danger on the other side of that is you get just as much misinformation, you get just as much fake news, and you get also very, I think, problematic elements where we haven't really delved into yet, and I don't know what the impact on young people is going to be in the next generation, where there's a lot of desensitization, I think, through social media. You can see dead bodies, you can see explosions, you can see war real time, and the free sharing of that information. And like when we talk about young people, we can't forget young people go from as young as like 7 years old on Twitter these days through to 29 or whatever what age cap you want to put on it. And I feel like we're not always as conscious of when we're doing that mass sharing, when we're doing that vocalization, when we're doing that, in effect, in some cases, radicalization in different forms around what ideology you're supporting, that actually young people are being impacted by that at maybe an age when they're more impressionable and don't have as much ability to discern what they're absorbing. But on the flip side, there are so many beautiful elements about it. As you mentioned, NSARS, like that was originally just a hashtag, and there were so many stories shared, and it actually brought up to a point where the reputational damage for the government was that they actually had to shut down their unit that was abusing people through official government channels. And unfortunately, they have another unit now named something else. But the actual process is something that momentum couldn't have been built up anywhere else. But as I say, the flip side of that is just as much quick sharing of hashtags. You've got a lot of meme culture. I've seen so many genuinely hilarious like snippets of like Donald Trump speeches that have been made into jokes. And it's like there was a point in time this man was genuinely the president of the country and the leader of the free world, and had the ability to. He was tweeting from his personal account, not even the presidential account. I'm going to blow up this country tomorrow. And these are things that it shouldn't be able to happen, in my view, in a sophisticated political arena, but here we are. And I feel like the ability for young people to toy with that information, on the one sense it's malleable and can become entertainment, on the other side it can be very serious and become very, well-defining political action, and it's not as easily controlled as we might like it to be, but actually the flip side of the fact it's not controlled is the important part, because it allows that truth and that genuine action to get out. But I think you have to be a lot more discerning when you're on it. The only other thing I would say is that social media has taught me a lot about how to understand other people's cultures and understand the real world nuances and relevance in the geographic region of how things are happening, because I can have people, an everyday person that lives in the village, tell me and walk me through actually what you saw on that video was not actually this, it was that. And I remember when I first went into international development, I was in a village in rural Ghana for like 6 months. I'd never been to any other country before. And before we went in country, they sat us down, they told us a story of the colored glasses. I don't know if anyone's heard this story. If you indulge me, I'll tell you before. But no, basically, they tell the story of two different nations. There's one nation, everyone's born there, and when they're born, they are wearing blue glasses. And they walk around and they see everything, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, one of them goes to visit another nation and goes to see like what it's like over there, and those people are born with yellow glasses. So when they go over there, the guy says, "Oh, hey, take some yellow glasses. You can live like us, see like us." And he walks around, and then the guy comes back and says, "Oh," everyone says to him, "Oh, how was your time over there? Like, what was it like?" And he was like, "Yeah, it was amazing. Everything was green." Because the point they were trying to raise for us was that you can never wholly submerge yourself in another nation and not bring with you some of your biases, your inherent upbringing, all those other cultures. There was always a blend, and having social media give me a window into other people's lives and experiences helped me dismantle some of those internal biases I didn't realize I had, and hopefully get closer to seeing the actual yellow rather than the green. But I know I'll always be seeing green. But yeah, I just found that really pertinent in that story at that day, and as I've gone through social media and seen its evolutions, it's something that I've always tried to make sure I break down as much as possible.
And if I can touch on that, and it's great that you said all that, Calm, because I think you kind of exemplified it, which is that if we also talk about innovation, moving away from social media, one of the most innovative things that you can get from young people is the way that they think. And if we think about it, and I don't want to get too academic, so I'm not going to, but if we think about the way that, so there's kind of ways of thinking about things, especially when we think about deconstruction, and I'm going to tread very lightly about that because there's definitely negatives to deconstruction, but if we think about challenging concepts and the way that things are done, there are people that are developing these ideas who are often working in a field, but then young people are then brought up with these challenges to a certain field as what they're kind of used to. So they're used to these challenges, and then that means when they're entering a space, they'll enter it actively and constantly challenging the way things are done, and that's such a beautiful and unique thing that organizations are constantly seeking to improve the way that they do things. And a young person is going to almost instinctively do that when they see the processes in an organization. And yet, instead, you're going to, maybe seek a consultant or something like that to tell you how to do, how to do this.
£100,000.
For real, you'll pay so much. And yet, a young person could probably tell you that so quickly. And I think you kind of showed it in terms of maybe someone in a previous generation, if they'd gone to a country, they may not have thought in the exact same way that you did. But the way that you showed that kind of ability to think critically about what kind of influences and thoughts and kind of biases you're bringing into a situation, that's a unique thing that I think young people do so much more instinctively, and that's such a real gift that we shouldn't just kind of brush off as a small thing, but that organizations should really recognize and use for their own kind of benefit and growth.
You actually segued perfectly there into kind of the theme of this year's festival, I guess, is Read the World. And it's about how we can bring together global thinkers and writers to kind of cross these cultural and geographical boundaries in a way that creates more unity and empathy and understanding. And I think that is also true with international affairs. We're seeing these increasingly transboundary issues. We're seeing COVID-19, we're seeing climate change, and they don't, respect arbitrary boundaries, as it were. Yet we're seeing this increasingly divisive world where there's polarized politics and everything else that we see going on at the moment. So I think you've kind of slightly touched on it, but how do we navigate these complex issues across different countries and boundaries in international affairs successfully? How do we kind of keep this empathy and understanding, and how do you see those kind of concepts in your day-to-day work, I guess? So.
I think it's a great question. I would say, the first thing is as we touched on, bringing some self-reflection as to what you're bringing to the table when you arrive. I always try to acknowledge that you can't wholesale import one solution from one place to another, because there are so many cultural, historical, and other things that you just won't be aware of. And I think I always try to do whenever I've been sent to a new country or a new place is to just ask myself why maybe this hasn't been done before, and then I actually say, wait, let me ask the people who are here why this has not been done before, because it's very easy to just land and say, oh yeah, look, we just need to do this and that, when you quite embarrassingly often find out this has been tried 17 times already, and this has happened, that's happened, and there's a reason why we're not doing it that way. And I think one thing that I really liked about one of the organizations I worked with, International Service, is that whenever they sent people in country, they always paired them with people who actually are from the country, and made sure that you walk around with them, you walk to them, you talk to them, and not just dictate to them, and you don't come in as a manager over anyone. It's actually a co-creative effort. So I think one of those things is just really understanding that people are different, cultures are different, and there's a reason why things are done. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And one thing I found really valuable, I think, tapping into the strength of diasporas, wherever they are, whether it's this country or another country, when people move and migrate between different nations, they often pick up some of the unspoken nuances and things that you might not realize or recognize because you haven't had to. And I think one valuable thing about the youth or this generation is that in the age of globalization, we've grown up with a lot more different demographics around us. We've been able to see different, even just small things, food, culture. You might learn 1 or 2 words in school about how you say hi or bye in another person's culture. Being able to just bridge that gap even initially with those small touch points has really made it easier for me to engender better dynamics before we even start talking about the politics, before we even start talking about the action and the change. Actually, we're all people, and how do you build that rapport and that engagement? So I think that's something I've found very valuable.
Yeah. I think a very practical thing that I would say is learn languages, people. Yeah, like if you want to engage with somebody, if you're going to try and work in development, let's say, or going to try and work with a community, if you need a translator to engage with that community, I'm not saying that everyone that's working with a community should speak the language, but what I'm trying to say is there's always a need for the understanding that if you can't speak to somebody in their language and you need someone else to maybe translate for you, there's always going to be a certain gap. There's always going to be a certain kind of divide. That means that what you're saying, what you're suggesting is often through like a filter which often misses maybe just certain aspects of somebody's lived experience. It's one of the major reasons why I'm learning French. It's one of the reasons why I'm in the process of learning Yoruba, which is the language spoken in like southwest Nigeria. Is because I generally don't think that I would be able to, if I do in maybe like 20, 30 years work in international development, I'm not going to be able to help the whole world. I'm not going to be able to go across the world and be like, yeah, I can help you all, take this. Like, I won't be able to do that. But if I maybe focus on a few communities where I can actually engage with you, where I can actually speak to you, where I can actually learn from you, before I even think about giving you a solution, I think that's a step closer to an actual better solution making. Like when we say creative problem solving, sometimes the creativity doesn't even come from you being, a master of some form of scientific method. It could just be you being ready to listen, and then you understand something about their community that nobody else has because you're actually speaking to the community. And if we're really thinking about development, I think the communities are really the root of it. And so being able to some extent, and there's always limits, but to some extent engage through the language, I think is one of the first steps you can take, and also one of the biggest steps.
No, I think it's an important point. Like, first of all, just listening to people, because a lot of people don't listen; they just speak. And I feel like when you said speaking the language, if you can learn the language, it's amazing. But I think it's even more encompassing than that, like from body language to cultural norms to, speaking the language that people are receptive to. Remember when I first started working in Africa, there was this running joke about Africa time. People are always like 2-3 hours late to a meeting, and coming from the West where like you're still an insult, you're 10 minutes late, you're disrespecting me. There was only when I was there, like I think I was 2 months in, and someone quite senior in the government sat down with me and was explaining to me and said, the way we have culture here is, it's very familial structures. When we walk down the road, I might see an auntie, I might see an uncle, I might see someone who's not actually related to me, but we call them auntie, uncle, and I must greet them. And it's actually more insulting to my culture and to people for me to walk past that person and say hi, bye, just so I can get to the meeting on time, than it is for me to indulge in that moment and actually have that connection because I represent my community. So me having to actually shift my mind frame and understanding, where is the point of insult? The point of insult isn't you arriving late here. The point of insult was you walking past that person very briskly just because you wanted to get here. So I feel like as you start to be immersed in culture, you start to learn, respond, speak in the language that people are speaking to you in. And that doesn't mean that you can't bring new things. That doesn't mean that you can't have improvements. Doesn't mean that you can't change. But actually, if you don't meet people where they are, then you can't be walking anywhere together. And I think that is the root core of how I try to do anything in terms of international relations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think on that point of listening, I think for the last 15 minutes of the session, we really wanted to make sure that we'd heard from everyone here and kind of making sure that our dialogue is joined up with what is everyone else's views on international affairs and young people's role within it. So I think we'd like to use this time now to open it up to a Q&A. Any questions you can put towards Samuel and Calm, whether that's to do with youth participation, the future of international affairs as a field. And I think, if I'm right, you can just raise your hand and there's a roaming mic. So I'll hand it over to anyone who may want to be the first person to ask a question. if anyone would like to ask a question.
You answer first.
A question for all three of you, I suppose, and like a practical question. Do you have any tips for young people to be taken seriously in like professional environments? And perhaps if they don't have like the years of experience or maybe the academic background as well?
I guess that's as close. That's quite close. I think it's quite close to my position, especially before I went to university, because I'd hardly studied anything academically. Well, I think I'll focus on two main things. One is to be taken seriously. To a certain extent, you also need to take yourself seriously, and if you take yourself seriously, it reflects in ways you wouldn't even think about. It reflects in the way that you say certain things. It reflects in your body language. It reflects in, even if someone chooses not to take you seriously, it even reflects in your response to that. Because if you're taking yourself seriously, then you're like, if someone's not taking you seriously, then that's an insult, as opposed to just like, oh, that's what I was expecting. And then the second thing is don't devalue your passion, but also be very real. But you have to be very real about your situation. You know, you're not trying to present yourself as an expert. That's not who you are. You're somebody who has a passion, and so you'll present your passion. You know, if your value lies in your story, then the story is what you need to focus on. You know, that's what you need to relate to whoever you're speaking to. And I think that's a really important thing, like realizing who you are and what your value you have to add to that situation, but being very much forthright in that. I think that's where to start, because that's where I think I started. I had the passion. I kind of had a passion for hopefully being involved in this space, not even for playing around decision making. I just wanted to learn, and I thought that the best way to learn was to speak to people. So I reached out to people and I spoke to them. That's why I was taken seriously at first, just because I was someone that wanted to listen. And then little by little, I'd form an opinion and I'd say it. Now, I'd formed an opinion from discussions. Now, some of my opinions at the start might have been a bit shaky, but that's cool. Like, I formed it and I had a reason for thinking it. If it then gets questioned and broken down, then that's still a process of learning. And I think that real process, but starting off with just that being forthright in taking yourself seriously, and then two, really knowing your position and what you have to offer, that will help any young person, I think, just be taken a bit more seriously in whatever space.
Yeah, I would add to that. I would say it took me a long time to learn, but my first thing is, like, don't say yes to everything. Because a lot of times when you're seen as a young person in one space, people say, oh, come and talk about this now, or come here. And because you don't have actually that base, you're just there as a young person, it's very hard for you to be firm and confident in what you're bringing, as Sam has said. I think also building personal credibility and authenticity is really important. Before I did anything in international relations, I did stuff domestically, stuff that I cared about, stuff that was on my doorstep. I didn't like this thing. I wanted to try and change it. I went to join the school governing board because my school was terrible when I was at it. So it's these things that I think when you go through these processes, investing in passions that you care about, actually you gain a competency base to speak from that you feel more comfortable. The other part, which is more pragmatic, I say, is that in my experience, like people trade off a couple of types of currency. So you obviously have your competency currency, which is just how good you are at what you're doing. But then you have so much relational currency around like who you know and who introduced you. And so many things that I've been involved in is because someone endorsed me or someone said something. Like I said, I met Robin at something else, and then Robin said, come here, and it spiraled. But I think another thing that I have to be honest and recognize, like a relative privilege, is that I went to Oxford. So when I say I went to Oxford, some people that didn't listen to me before started listening to me just because I have an academic background now. And these things are wrong. But I think there's so many situations in life where you have this kind of legacy currency, where by association with an institution or a workplace or a project, oh, I did a program with DFID once. I was there for 5 days and I advised them something, but because I said that now, you're letting me into the room to now do this project. And I'm not saying that you should go around blagging your life. But what I am saying is that when you are associated with things that you care about, but then that allows you to become associated with things that other people care about too, it makes it easier for you to step into rooms and have those conversations because you built up currency along multiple levels. And I think it's not something that happens overnight, but it helps.
I think I would echo many of the things both of you have said. I think if you're truly passionate about something, you do gain legitimacy from that. You can't doubt authenticity, and I think with that comes more credibility. I also think kind of on what you were saying about who you know and things like that, it can sometimes feel frustrating, whereas maybe it feels like getting into positions is really inaccessible. But I think it's like kind of opening your eyes to see the other side of the coin, that we can also kind of create our own opportunities to have our, like, if people won't let you in the room, we can talk about our ideas online. You can self-publish a blog post if someone else won't publish it for you. If you can't, you can reach out to people on LinkedIn who you want to share your ideas with. You can send them an email, and it might even catch them off guard that there's a young person who really so passionately wants to reach out. And I think in that way we can kind of turn the barriers to our advantage, and you can create your own opportunities. Obviously within reason, there's always barriers, but I think, yeah, it's flipping the coin around and realizing that like our innovation can be an advantage. Do we have any other questions? There's one in the back.
Yeah, I think there's one subject, that seems to be avoided when it comes to this question of sustainability on the planet, and that's the amount of the human population on the planet, which I think has probably gone up about tenfold in the last few hundred years, and is obviously driving, there's problems on the planet, because there's so many people on the planet using up all the planetary resources, and but nobody seems to want to address this problem. So I don't know whether do you ever discuss that sort of problem at Chatham House? How you going to deal with the world population? I mean, I think China dealt with it, say, in the 70s by the one-child policy, but that never seems to be adopted anywhere else in the world, and it's not, so is that something you ever bear in mind?
If the question is, is there where we had a direct conversation around population control? No. But have we thought about populations, consumption, and global inequality often? And I think it's clear from all the research produced by Chatham House that overpopulation is not a problem. It is actually inefficient, unequal distribution of resources globally, and excess wastage by corporates and wealthier nations that causes the imbalances that we have. That's not to say that there isn't a finite number at some point in time where there is going to be a resource gap between people, but actually there are many other practices we need to address as a global society around how we produce, how we waste, this kind of constant churn of new items, new upgrades, especially in modern times, that causes wastage, loss of resource, and overusage more than actual individuals being on the planet. So we've spoken to all of those different issues, but we've never spoken to the issue specifically of, do we need the population control? Because the research that we've done so far doesn't bring us to those conclusions personally. That's what I've come across. I don't know, Sam, have you seen anything?
I think this is one of the situations where I think I'll reflect what you previously said, which is that in certain situations I won't know much. This is a situation where I don't think I could reflect with much insight on population control. But I think I agree with all of what you said.
I think from what I've done in terms of being a young advisor on climate adaptation, it definitely would be, I'd reframe it as it's a question of inequality, and it's a question of justice. And this is where you look at climate justice and environmental justice, and you look at the fact that actually it's about, we should be taking accountability of, in certain countries, we have a disproportionate consumption, and we have a disproportionate greed over natural resources, and that's impacting other countries disproportionately. And it is that rebalance that we need to address. That's the core fundamental problem. And as you noted, it's about tackling the root causes. So it's about consumerism and overconsumption and inequality on a much larger scale. And I think addressing that will solve so many problems, because as you've said, there are a lot of studies done showing that we actually have the money needed to, if we took it out of certain other practices and we put it into, say, climate adaptation, the money is there. It's just it hasn't been redistributed. So I think it's more about how do we reframe our thinking around some of these big issues. Do we have any other questions? I think we've probably got time for about one more before we'll have to wrap up.
It seems to me at the moment that a lot of development tends to be coming from accrued knowledge and also unbiased education usually. I find within this country specifically, there seems to be systemic classism, which is preventing a lot of people from accessing that education to actually form opinions other than what they find on the internet. which, as you were addressing earlier, can entrench further bias. And I'm specifically talking about working class people looking for the opportunity to actually find their feet in terms of progressing their opportunities and potential career. How would you go about removing the dangers of social media which enforce biased views?
That's a great question. Actually, it's something that I'll have to take back to Robin and the guys at Chatham House, because it's something we looked at recently in terms of youth engagement, and the fact that Chatham House has tons and tons of articles and research that is not freely available. It's a paywall. You have to be a member, and you have to be accepted to be a member first of all, then you have to pay to continue to be a member. And we thought about posting some of our content freely online without a paywall, but what does that mean for eroding our actual membership base, which we need to fund the organization in some ways as well. So there's a lot of tension around that, but actually I personally would be on the side of make it all free. And that doesn't mean nonsensically don't think about the commercial strategy of how we continue to have the organization to run, but I definitely have sympathies with that. Like I identify as working class. I grew up on a sub 16K income household, and I didn't know the field of international relations existed. I didn't know where to access that information, and it was just by the support and kindness, I guess, of people that have helped guide me along this way that I managed to get to a place where I am. So I think, one thing that we can immediately do as Chatham House is to think about in what way can we remove that paywall and that access to information for younger people. I know we do have projects in schools where we give out certain resources, but that's not enough. Another suggestion that I would have in terms of supporting working class people is that even the freedom to be able to indulge in knowledge is a privilege in itself. Being able to go back to university and do a master's, do a doctorate, not even just talking about paying for these courses, even if they were completely free, actually the cost-benefit analysis of I'm not going to be a working person in my family and being able to feed back to my mom or my household or whatever the bills are, these are real realities that a lot of people contend with that are not part of the conversation because, as you say, academia at that level is oftentimes quite elitist. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I'm glad you raised that question because it's not something that I've even thought to bring back to Chatham House before, but it's something that I would definitely do now.
Yeah. I think there's two parts to your question, which both of them are really important, which is that one, there's actually a barrier to getting this type of information. I didn't really have access to Chatham House articles or information before becoming a young advisor, simply because I wouldn't have paid the membership before, and I wouldn't have had to receive much exposure to the fact that it was possible. And then the second aspect, which is the idea of social media and how we make it less biased. I have no idea. I have no idea how we repair social media. And that's something that I think requires a lot of research and requires a lot of theorizing, and also requires a lot of intentionality on the part of the social media networks. And sometimes I think it's questionable how much intentionality they have, because when you take people out of their echo chambers, like part of what people like about social media is the fact that it reinforces their view. And how we really challenge that is quite an important thing. But I think focusing on that kind of first part of the question, which is a bit easier for me to tackle, I generally do think that, one, making things free, and secondly, opportunities need to be more widely spread. The fact, like, even things like this Chatham House, being a young advisor needs to be more made known on a wider basis. I shouldn't just have to learn about it through somebody who knows about it. It should be just something that you're able to stumble upon. And this is that's how you allow people who wouldn't normally engage with things to stumble upon these things, by having it widely spread. So if organizations are, for example, creating opportunities for people to learn about things, the publicity process needs to be a really, really important and well thought through process. Because if you're running an event that's teaching people about things, great. But if people who don't normally get access to it aren't actually able to find it, then you're not really countering the problem so much. So I think publicity of events like this, VoiceBox, and this other, of course, VoiceBox is a great start, but then making it more widely known is a great thing. And other organizations which seek to make events, which seek to target young people, thinking about that publicity so that it's not just reaching people that go to Oxford, or people that go to schools which commonly share materials with them, but also there's people who won't find anything through their school or university, but may just find it, as they're online someday.
I think, unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time, so we're going to have to wrap up our questions. But I would really like to thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. And thank Samuel and Calm for coming. Thank you.